as something fundamental, as something that has blossomed into an expansive economic relationship and a deep political engagement, that there is no question that it has become the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. But then unexpected things happen, and that's life. And today we are in a period of extraordinary uncertainty in the US-China relationship. You have to be a really bold man to predict where it is going. But I think we are in a relationship that suggests, we are at a moment that suggests the past is not necessarily going to be a guide to the future. And if and when the Chinese and the Americans work out a different template, a different framework for the bilateral relationship, much of the rest of the world will have to adapt to that new circumstance. And I think that's where the India-China relationship, or more broadly, China-South Asia relationships will all come in, that much in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, the US-Soviet relationship was one which others had to adapt to. Today in the 21st, it is the US-China relationship that we all have to adapt to the twists and turns in that relationship. So we really, Professor Go, we look forward to your presentation. Take your time, I mean maybe about 25, 30 minutes, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interest and questions in what you have to say. And Professor Go is, as I said, at Shanghai, focuses on geopolitics, looks at China's policy towards East Asia and South Asia. The floor is yours here.
Thank you very much, my very good friend, Rajma Han. And I'm so happy to be here. I'm also lucky to be the first, as you said, a Chinese scholar to visit this center, this institute. I have been to Singapore and also I think this university before, but not at this time. Stay here for 3 weeks. It looks like I feel like very. I stay at home with homesick, home, like that. I stay here, very pleasant, and so I mean, very kind people. I really enjoyed my life here, and also I enjoyed my talks with my colleagues here, and so I appreciate very much Professor Rajmahan, particularly your help and cooperation for my talk here and visit here. My talk is about China-Indian relations, but as the chairman said, I do also look at this relationship from a very broad, from geopolitical or strategic view. As you said, if you look at when China and U.S. established relations 40 years ago, so you can say it's a changing of the international order. When China, China, U.S., and Soviet Union, and 40 years later, after one generation, you can see some also other kind of uncertainties are coming, not only from the power, the powers of different countries, because the power structure is changing, but also some uncertainties from leadership. There are so many countries now, the leadership, the change of leadership also affects the international relationship. I think people worry about China-U.S. relationship because of Trump. People know something that has a different understanding of him, about Chinese President Xi Jinping, also different understanding, right? Also about Indian Prime Minister Modi, right? He got the second term several months ago. So people talk about how about the second term is the foreign policy toward China, talk about its neighboring countries. So many uncertainties. So I think that China-Indian relationship, we talk about this, we have to talk about the whole, even you look at the bilateral relationship from a global level, a global perspective. So for me, I focus more about China-US, how China-US competition. Everyone knows the trade war between China and the United States for the last year. So people are worried about the international economy, worried about the international security issues, talk about even Taiwan, South China Sea, so many uncertain issues that we have to care about the most, particularly in this particular moment when people in China talk about it, when China is growing now so quickly, so rapidly and strongly, and now we have the strategic challenges from the United States we have to face. If you look at 10 years ago or 15 years ago, China entered WTO, or 20 years ago into WTO, China's power is growing so rapidly and fluently, generally speaking. But now you can see there's so many regional challenges and global challenges from outside, not only from the domestic affair, but also from internationally. So that is my original intention. I want to share my view with you that how we look at, when we talk about China-India relations, we look at the whole international landscape now. So that's my general idea, that why I choose this topic. It's my topic. I first, I have here, just share with you this how I look at China. I have a PPT here, China-India strategic cooperation. Until now, I would like to talk about the China-India relation very generally. Point. The strategic cooperation. In the last 4 years, particularly in the last 5 years, China, India, we have more. When we have the cooperation, but we'll have more traditional challenges. One challenge for China, India is the geopolitical, from geopolitical understanding of changing in Indian Ocean. At the same time, it means it's connected with Chinese BRI initiative, and also later with the American Indo-Pacific strategy. So this is one people, I think, in United States, in China, and I think here, many agree that there will be a long-term and fundamental changes to the geopolitics since the end of the Cold War. I agree with that point. So if you look at the whole power structure, international order, also talk about the geopolitics, the more serious about these traditional changes. More military intervention, more military means are used in the international affairs now. Compared to 20 years ago, these are the basic changes. So this is the one. I don't want to talk about more about that, but just one like this, we have a Chinese saying that 一山难容二虎. As a great man cannot broke a rival. Literally, as I mean, two tigers cannot live in one mountain. That's to many Chinese. If you look at the China-India relationship, it's like two tigers. People think it's one elephant, one dragon, but actually it's two tigers in South Asia and also Asia. So many Chinese are curious why India have this. For many people, for many Chinese say that we are facing a challenge from U.S. You built U.S. in number one, but for Indian, not the U.S. fundamentalists understanding that now the AUS is the number one challenge to India. China is number one. So this is the unbalanced understanding. So when we talk about Chinese perspective, 一山难容二虎, we talk about China and the US. When the Indian talk about 一山难容二虎, we talk about India and China. So this is the when India's now national power is growing, the economy is surpassing China. So people talk about China and India. Now it's one elephant, one tiger, one dragon, or two tigers. You understand? It can live, can survive at the same time in the same mountain. This is the big challenge. This is the big question. So this is the one I share. The second is challenge, as I mentioned now, the BRI in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. This is the one people regard the Chinese offensive. Can be regarded, many from India or from the US, many Western countries regard the Chinese. This is the strategy of Chinese government, offensive. because the government said we 有所作为, we have to do something. That is BNR is initiative or initial understanding or intention. But we'll talk about a bit about the BNR later. But here is the Indian concern about China. It's not only in South Asia, but in the whole Indian Ocean, Indian region. So for many Chinese, there's a question why Chinese military presence in the IRR as a threat, not the US, and not France, not the UK. They have been staying for many years for US, for half a century. But why China is a threat? So this is traditional concern. This is, we said, security dilemma between countries. The traditional understanding, this is when other opposite power is stronger, there can be a threat to itself. So there's a challenge but literally, basically it's a challenge by the BRI. I admit, there's no doubt the Chinese BNR initiative brings some, challenge to Indians' foreign policy, Indians also geopolitical understanding. This is the fact, reality. The question is how the neighboring countries or smaller countries, because there are so many smaller countries in South Asia and also ASEAN region, how they think about China and India. So is the power balance diplomacy of ASEAN countries can continue between China and India? And smaller, these South Asia countries are seeking, like Nepal, like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, are seeking the similar foreign policy, like balanced power theory, balanced power policy. There's so many questions, so many uncertainties among China, India, and among China and ASEAN, China, South Asia countries relationship. So for the India side, they say, also in the last 5 years, they have the Indian projects like Masong and the Spice Road, also can be regarded as a counterbalance of Chinese BNR. Like the policy changed from looking east to acting east. So there are others like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor by India and Japan. So India now, in the past several years, Indian relation with Japan growing fast, moving fast. Ambi visits and Modi visit several times bilaterally. They have also dialogue. So this is, I think, the geopolitical changes. The third one is US Indo-Pacific strategy. Until now, I would like to say from original, when the launching of this strategy, I remember it's 2017 or 2018, particularly late 2018, when Trump visits South Asia, which is in Vietnam. I think remember the meeting said launched the Indo-Pacific strategy. China is not worry too much because its understanding of is a political strategy or economic. Until now, people are worried about military alliance with Japan, Australia, India, the Quad. We call the dialogue, the four countries. But later, when they hold the Quad security dialogue together, China raised more concern about this strategy, Indo-Pacific. So the intentions when Trump, American government, Trump administration reached this strategy, and later they published, in 2008 they have the national security report strategy when they published, also military strategy, or take China as a strategic competitor. Later, after that, China put more, I think, from my understanding, China more concerned about Indo-Pacific strategy, if we say. One of the most important issue is India's role in this region or in the Indo-Pacific strategy. What kind of role? So, Indian big power foreign policy, when they take China as a threat in the next decades or maybe another century, another half a century or this century, how India will use, people say, will use the American foreign policy as a means to counterbalance China. And China is sometimes, also worried about how the U.S. will use the India as a counterbalance against China. So this trilateral relationship is growing. That's why it mentions more concern about China, India, and USA. So this is another, I think, is the background. If you look at the geopolitically of this bilateral relationship from a geopolitical perspective, this is the background. Next, I look about China, U.S. I use it as shadow, because whenever you talk about the Indian foreign policy toward China, people say, "Oh, where is India? Where is the USA?" So when you talk about the China, when we talk about the American foreign policy toward China, people in China will say, "Where is India?" So what kind of role India will play there? So questions on that Indian strategic relationship. You can see there's so many topics. I just read the several that we have to think about it. One is China-U.S. trade war can be a good or bad for India. I know Indian friends, many in Delhi or somewhere, so we say this is a good opportunity for India. But also I read, some reports that it's not good for India, because you can see the trade protectionism, the shrinking of the world markets. You cannot now see more free trade because even the value chain even stops. It's not good for India. So that means when you say good, it's more bilateral understanding. If you say not good, it's more global understanding. So this is also understanding. You can see the also challenge not for China but also for India. About also China's military interference, and also China's confrontation with USA in East China Sea, South China Sea, even over Taiwan. How about the use India will choose? Last year, I remember several articles talk about the Indian relationship with Taiwan. Some very be regarded as very extreme understanding or opinion on Indian foreign policy that they want to improve the Indian government's relationships with Taiwan from unofficial even to official relationship. And in China, not so many people really care too much because it's the small voice, but it's very extreme understanding of development of the relationship between India and Taiwan. So how the Indian will choose? If the really military confrontation over Taiwan, over South China Sea, over East China, over Diaoyu Islands, So this is another concern that we connected with USA. How the U.S. Also Indian governments can handle the strategic autonomy? I remember this is the always big question in China and Indian academic circle when we always talk about can you maintain the strategic autonomy? Yes, they said we can. So when Modi had the speech in Shangri-La meeting last year, a year ago, they said 2 years ago, it talked about the Quad cannot be developed as an alliance against the third country. This is one, I think, promise or kind of a gesture to Chinese government that India will maintain its long-term strategic autonomy, but it's not totally that make Chinese governments feel this really can do. Because the reason is the U.S. and Indian military exchanges. If you say this strategic autonomy, how can you explain the military cooperation between U.S. and India? The technology, you say the military technology, even the weapons, now is selling more efficient, more advanced to India. People talk about the F-14 of the Russian system defense, but USA we can provide more advanced to you. So there are others about. I don't want to mention more, but about. So they're also connected to China, Russia, India triangle relationship. Any concrete improvements? So many uncertainties now. Last one, what I mentioned is Iran. Iran issue is not just to China and India. It's not just a regional security topic. It's connected with China and India's energy security. Iran, I remember, is the #1 exporter of to India, the oil. So this is a big challenge. For China, it's also connected with Chinese energy channel, security channel, I think from the Middle East to Indian Ocean to Malacca, even to South China. So it's a long way. This is why it's connected with BNR, with Marine Security Time initiative. So this is so many, it's a shadow of China-US competition over so many traditional and untraditional issues in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the whole coast. I think the Indian Ocean, Euro-Russian coast, from the Middle East to Malacca, even to South China Sea. So as we see that there's geopolitical also understanding of that. So strategic challenge to India, I mentioned the foreign policy, where China is the Indian society and fear of China's growth. I don't want to repeat that. And also intensify China-India security dilemma over the border issue, the Donglang Crisis, the border debate. This one make Chinese people worry too much, or most in 2017, that China-Indian relation went out of control in August, 2 years ago. So this, for many Chinese, I want to repeat later. Okay, the third one is the role of ASEAN. We are talking about this topic in Singapore. Singapore is playing very important role in ASEAN countries, this forum. For 10 countries in ASEAN, we usually 40 years ago, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, we have 10 plus 1, 10 plus 3. Now later India, we have the East Asia Summit. You can see ASEAN is playing the leading role always in the regional economic and political integration. Until now, I can say. But now in the ASEAN countries is facing a new challenges. How can they face the challenge from China-India competition and China-US competition? Can ASEAN countries, people say ASEAN countries among themselves, they are facing, they have to choose a side. So small countries, they will disagree with each other, like Singapore, maybe Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia. There are so many countries here that maybe some of them, like Philippines, we have territory disputes with Philippines, with Vietnam, Malaysia. So they have different opinions. But is it possible for ASEAN to play a continuing role in managing or improving this regional integration? China, I think, always supports that, but so many challenges now, so many concerns, even over South China Sea disputes. Donglang Crisis, just 1 minute about that. I said it's a tipping point for second China-Indian war, but I would like to say China is a Donglang Crisis make Chinese governments, or I cannot represent Chinese government. I give my own understanding, is my own perspective. People talk about Donglang Crisis is one case, one example, make Chinese governments pay more attention to Indian responses or border issue. But at the same time, my point is not only China, is also make Indian government to rethink about its policy toward China. So that's why coming the Wuhan summit meeting. So we have the Wuhan summit spirit. I think both sides reached consensus that first is don't make this border disputes out of control. That's the main first consensus. So until now, in last month, there's still bilateral talk about the border issues. But maintain state quo. We'll talk about later more details. So there's a new consensus of resetting China-India relations. The last part I wanted to talk about very generally now. Now they can answer questions. China-India is an issue. This bilateral relationship is an issue concerned connected with how we Asian people, Asian countries think about can we make this a sustainable Asian rise? I raised this question many times in China and in India, in Pakistan. We have to think about that. Even Asian countries, think about it. China has been rising for decades, more than decades for. And China can be regarded big power now. Even American President Donald Trump says China is not the developing country, right? I think I agree with that. China cannot be regarded as a developing country, particularly over economically. I think you cannot see that. But China is a big power now. 20 years, 20th century, 20 years in 21st century. Peaceful now, until now, China's peaceful development with no war with neighboring countries in the last 40 years. Can India maintain another 40 years of peaceful rise? With no war with China, with Pakistan, with neighboring countries? Can or cannot? If so, the Asian rise can continue for more than half a century. That's the way we see really a reality of Asian rise. Asian rise cannot be just rely on China's rise. It's also on Indian rise. That will continue. These are sustainable Asian rise. So will be a true Asian century. So what's the other long-term goal for China and India's national interest strategy? So can we find any consensus to take the economic development as first, upgrading the people's living standard, finally promotes comprehensive national power? So I'm thinking, I always tell when we talk about with Indian colleagues, say, what are the goals of the Indian national strategy? We know ourselves clearly when Deng Xiaoping opened the door 40 years ago, our goal. And when we want to reach the goal, we have foreign policy and domestic reforms. So we have very clear strategies. How about India? If the Indian main strategic objective is really want to develop the economy, you have to also make adjustments of the foreign policy toward neighbors. That's for China, it learns. So, and also there are others.
Take your time.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, another 2 points. So how about a mixed competition between China and India? I said use the word geopolitical and economic view. In recent years, I just talk about the geopolitical understanding of China and India relationship, but I really do more understanding of this relationship from geo-economic perspective. There are so many changes I have to think about it. We have to think about it. It's China and India, if we reach a goal on national strategy that is both on developing economy and both we have to maintain a good relationship with each other. Both of us want a peaceful region in South Asia, in ASEAN region. So if there is a strategic consensus, that will be very good for benefit to China, and India also benefit for the whole region. If we can do that, India have to also think about its policy toward the USA. As I mentioned, the trilateral relationship, the Quad, also the U.S. now the Indo-Pacific policy now is moving forward. Two months ago, when the launch of the U.S. American Indo-Pacific strategy, if you look at the details, the U.S. now is focusing on not so many militaries, but more diplomatic measures with ASEAN countries, with India, but behind that more is military concern. That is, India have to think about it, or also China has to think about it. So, China-India cooperation can make a sustainable Asian rise if both sides oppose. I'm talking about not this time, maybe in the answering Q&A time. I'm talking about here more generally, more globally, not bilaterally. Both oppose trade protectionism and unilateralism and push together forward the economic globalization, because free trade and free market is both necessary for China and India, because they are developing countries. If you look at both on China, there's so many, we have big population, both of us. Also, both find South Asia regional integration as a key for Indian peaceful rise. The Southeast Asia is not a battleground for geopolitical competition, but a new region for Indo-Pacific economic integration. I think we have to think this opportunity is an opportunity, not a challenge. What I mean is that China and India, we work together in ASEAN regions in South Asia, not as a strategic competition that between China and India. Because all these countries along the Indian Ocean coast, except from Indonesia to the Saudi Arabia, from my understanding, more and more countries now would like economic development in the region. Even include this one, Saudi Arabia, the MBS, right? Mohammed bin Salman. He visits Pakistan and India received him very, very highly, right? Why? Because all of them, they know that geopolitical struggle, geopolitical competition is not good for all of us. They would like, this is something behind the geopolitics. I'm not talking about the very short term. I'm talking about in these next decades. You can see this is a trend. But the outside challenges from USA, and also China-US competition. So I think ASEAN and China and ASEAN, India and ASEAN, now we are meeting. This is a cross meeting place in ASEAN region. So I think I don't see any more until now. China and India in ASEAN region have more military competition. No. I see more cultural. I think this every years more cultural, more economic, more trade. So strategic opportunity for China and India. I think if we can look at the change, if we change the policy, so many changes and opportunities. So think about it. Do I finish? Or I have to see, almost finished. Okay.
No, take it.
Yeah, the area for strategic cooperation. One is South Asia, the regional economic integration. We all know the SACA. Why not membership for China? Many Chinese always ourselves. Why with India, China ourselves? China accept India and Pakistan as a member of SCO. And why not China? Because always multilaterally, Indian government or Indian scholars think that China will dominate. It's worried about China will dominate this region if China will allow China to join. Well, I always tell them, why we think this? Think about 40 years ago when China invited Japanese to invest in China, to invite the USA to invest in China, to invest Singapore, right? Hong Kong investment to invest. 40 years ago, China never think about Japan will control China, or will control this region. If China takes the opportunity, right? But why India take China as a threat or challenge when want China join the SACA? Another point I would say that China, Xinjiang, the Tibet region also is part of South Asia, right? China, many don't think about it. China actually is a South Asian country. Why not China join that? If China join the SACA or join the South Asia economic integration is good for all of us, why not? So this is a challenge not only for China, but also for Indian foreign policy. BCIM and others, with more, BCIM until now is no more progress actually. Until now it stopped actually. Until now, I don't see any just working level. I don't see any great progress on that. Energy security, I think is a new coming. I think a consensus that China can do that with India. The American sanction against Iran is, I think, but. This is a big question now. Indian relationship with Iran, with China. So energy geopolitics in the Middle East. I have another topic. It's not beneficial to China and India. As I said, Iran is the third largest supplier of crude oil to India, and it's fourth as a member to China. But I just know the number. China in the past 1 year, China's import the crude oil from Iran has decreased 60%, almost stopped until now, because of the USA. This is another big question. We can talk about these U.S. sanctions. You see this picture. I see Donald Trump receives our MBS and Imran Khan also in the White House. How you see sanctions. Last one is economic globalization model. I just mentioned this is one area. But I would like to just focus on one point: is China and India can cooperate in this over these issues over multilateral way, like the BRIC, like I think Shanghai Cooperation is one. Oh, also another trilateral: China, India, and Russia. We have the trilateral dialogue, trilateral mechanism of cooperation. So, foreign affairs ministers, always meeting, also summit meeting. So, as a multilateral way, I think more. I think these three countries. Another one point is that just my idea now. China, India, and Russia is the three biggest country in the real Russian continent. If these three countries, the cooperation among these countries, among this continent, in this continent, you can see the stability of your Russia, at least Russia. At least in Asia. If the stability in Russia, in Asia can maintain, we can, I think geopolitically understanding the USA role, the American role in Euro-Russian, especially in Asia, I believe sooner or later will decrease. But it relies on China and India at most. I stop here. I'm sorry, maybe you the time and two questions. Yeah.
No, not at all. It was, I thought, so absorbing, and I think you laid it out so well. The logic and the imperative for more cooperation, and the difficulty of actually doing it. I think you laid out both regional, global, multilateral, on the various multilateral institutions. So I think it's a fairly comprehensive framework in which we can actually examine the shift in the US-China relationship and what does it do to India-China relationship. There, I struck by one important formulation you made. I thought was about China being a South Asian country. In fact, I always believed in that. It's not just, you said Xinjiang is part
Tibet,
of
Tibet.
Tibet. So if you go to Xinjiang, you see
Xinjiang
it's so similar to the Pakistan or of South Asian style. The meat they eat, the style, the culture, the carpets is as much South Asia as you can get. Is Central Asian as well, of course. Tibet and the links that it has with India, Buddhism, is again very much part of this. So I would even add Yunnan perhaps for it, because if you look at Eastern India, in fact in the old days there was the Tea Horse Road that connected Yunnan to India through northern Burma. So you could think of the geography as a fundamentally many uniting features, notwithstanding the Great Himalayas, that there was a historic cultural interaction, trade, commerce, etc. But then the question is, why is it that we don't get along? Or why is it that what we say seems to be very different from what we do? That I think is you posed it fairly starkly, from trade issues, from the question of membership issues to full lot of things. I would say, I mean, maybe just three things. I mean, I think one, for all the goodwill and history, the problem of sovereignty is still, we are stuck on that. In some ways, we are locked in a situation where the sovereignty of neither country can be fully completed without the acceptance by the other. China is very much part of the Kashmir dispute in one way or another. China sits on part of the Kashmir, so people think it's a bilateral dispute. It's actually trilateral. In a sense, China is a very, very important part of it. Similarly, you didn't go too much into Tibet. India's position on Tibet, of course, raises questions about the nature of India's relationship with Chinese sovereignty. So those issues have not ebbed. And then you have the actual boundary dispute of unresolved. It's not just a boundary dispute. It's Chinese say the India-China boundary is about 2,000 kilometers. And 2,000. Indians say it's 4,000. So you can choose your side, whether it's 2,000 kilometers or 4,000 kilometers. No, there's a way of explaining it, but it's really, it tells you the divergence on the ground. We don't even agree on where we are on the boundary. That is, while India, Pakistan have a dispute, there is a line of control. It is demarcated, fully demarcated by the two militaries, agreed where we are. In the Chinese case, we don't even agree on where the line of separation is. That is, physically, we don't agree. This is where the current line is. Okay, we have dispute, but we don't even agree on where we are. I mean, it tells you the logic of the problem. And the third is the whole problem of relationship to the West has been a historic problem. 1927, if you go back to when India-Chinese nationalist delegations met in Brussels Anti-Imperialist Congress, and if you read that statement, Nehru was heading the Indian delegation, Chinese was a nationalist Chinese delegation, that essentially said, look, we are Asians, we are rising, we are emerging, we're going to fight the West and the colonial world order, we're going to work together to change the world, there is going to be a new dawn, etc., etc. But if you read the rhetoric of that, even today in BRICS, in RIC, it's still the same template that, look, we will work together, we will change the world, we are the inheritors of the, and the West is on decline. I mean, that argument. But yet, we've not been able to cooperate on critical issues. Just one example, 1927, we thought we were going to work together to change the world. But when the Japanese invaded China, then you had Chiang Kai-shek came to Delhi or Calcutta, wanted to met Gandhi and said, look, why don't we fight the Japanese first? Gandhi said, no, we're fighting the Brits first. So we couldn't really agree. I mean, despite great solidarity of the Indian people with the Chinese people, there was no agreement. And then we had the Cold War. When China was pro-America, India was anti-America. When China was anti-America, India became pro-America. So you had a kind of constant asynchronic wave, as the mathematics might say, that 60s, India was close to the US, China was not. 70s and 80s, US became closer to China, India was very angry. And now as India gets closer to China, China gets very suspicious of what's going on. So I think these are the broad levels at which the disputes have played out. I think one final thought in terms of, while we broadly, is the question of the China's role in South Asia. I think that it is not just when you raise the question of SAARC, the nature of when the Chinese constantly raise the question of India-US relationship, Indians constantly raise the China-Pakistan relationship and what it does to Indian security. So we are in a bit of a jam there, but whether the big picture shuffle that is taking place, will it open spaces? I thought that's where I think your presentation was most important. Does it open spaces for new compromises, new understandings? That is, if China has bigger problems with the US, will it be nicer to India? Will India see a potential room for compromising with China so that it can get some of its security issues done? So these are, I think, all the issues that actually open up possibilities, multiple lines of possibilities that open up. And along with that, the floor is open. So all of you, please chip in. And I think you asked short, sharp questions. So you wanted to come in, or is it because the Professor Hussain from Washington?
I learned a lot from your presentation. One question and one comment. The United States has been opposed to CPEC. I would like to know from you if this opposition is a strategic issue in the context of US-China relations, and the United States intends to oppose both Pakistan and China with opposition to CPEC, or it is just a sort of pressure tactics to put pressure on Pakistan to help in Afghanistan and also in bringing about action against the militancy. So what is the import or significance of this? Is it a larger strategic instrument, or just a pressure tactics against Pakistan? I will make a comment later on, but let me hear from you first.
Thank you, Ambassador. I didn't talk about CPEC. That's not in my presentation.
Too many things.
Too many things. So many topics. CPEC, in China we call this is a flag projects. And flag projects as in China BNR initiative. In China, there are also misunderstandings of CPEC and its progress, even its project. Regarded as CPEC is a strategic, geopolitical or strategic means for China to enter South Asia and Indian Ocean, because we have a CPEC tour from Xinjiang to Aguada in Buluchi. So this is a long way. It's a rail, train, and road, and also air. Maybe also the pipeline, oil and gas. But until now, I don't believe that. Last year I visited in Pakistan 4 times. I also met some businessmen who had Chinese company invest there. They told me, and we have private talks. We have until now it's just China doing more infrastructure, and as local living I think facilities like power projects. And there's no actually highway. Actually, China is doing from the CPEC understanding. Just a week ago, I remember that they have finished one. I think it's from. I can't remember exactly that part of the highway from. I think it's in Punjabi area. But it's not really from the geopolitical or CPEC understanding of this project until now. For India and USA, I think it's more. I'm concerned of that the future consequences. Like India, China cannot understand that when we talk with Pakistan, that we don't take sides over Kashmir sovereignty issues. We do that. We don't do that. But Indian government says because your CPEC crossed this disputed area, so we will oppose that CPEC. So China later, I remember he said, China ambassador said, maybe we change the name, right? So he said no, until now, no. So it's interesting that China don't talk about it actually now with India. Sometimes we maybe talk about it, but because it's kind of issue very concerned, sensitive to Indians. So India's concern now, until now, is a future concern. I think is future concern of China's influence in this region, not concrete or military or political or economic threats in this region. But think about the sovereignty is issue. But in the long term, because you look at, I would like to back to your just mentioned your comment is India for half a century, from last century, India is the one after the partition. India is the dominant country in South Asia for more than half a century. You cannot change that. So for many Indians, I think we think that it cannot change his idea, understanding of South Asia overnight. They said, this is our place. Similar like China, when 40 years, 60 years ago, South Asia, China is, around us, other small countries like South Korea, North Korea, Japan, all small, like geographically small countries. How can you, you can come here, can maybe control us?
A bit of hegemony.
Yeah. So this kind of, I think, is a mentality of own dominance position. But I'm still optimistic to that. India might will change a little. I think not so quickly but slowly. That Chinese involvement until now in South Asia is not military, it's economic. So like Nepal, like Bangladesh, Bangladesh, the Prime Minister just visited China last month, as you remember. Like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, they always think about, China's more economic cooperation. Why we don't do that? Why India oppose that? Because we were not part of India. So this is a very curious, very interesting situation. So come back to the question is how India, if you change the mentality of understanding China's role through CPEC or in this region, it will be very, very good for the whole Indian, I think, the national strategy. Second is about the USA. I remember when I was in 2017, when I was in Washington, D.C., at the very beginning, the people talk about CPEC in Washington. They said, let China do that. It's with the money. Let China do that. Because China is pushing money and get nothing. But later, how about now? It's about more concern about China's real influence in political, and political, economic, even military. They said the understanding in this region. So, if you look at the Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan visit several days ago in White House, so American also is changing a little bit. That take China's CPEC as a good for USA of the talk over Afghanistan, because it's an economic relationship. Pakistan economy is growing, it's good, it's stable, and it could be grow. It's good for Pakistan for the negotiation between Taliban and U.S. government, because it's good for that. So this is one change, I think. Yeah.
Diego? Yeah.
I have also two quick questions. The first one is, you said that India shouldn't look at China as a threat, but I would like to ask you, why shouldn't? And if you do a small mental exercise and imagine India building ports from the South China Sea to Japan to Korea, or India investing millions of dollars in all neighboring countries of China, and etc., would you think that China would see India as a threat or as an opportunity? The second question is, what do you think prevents more cooperation at the society levels between India and China? We don't have many students going, from China to India and vice versa. We don't have many tourists. We don't have, I think Indian cities are the only major cities in the world, maybe, without a Chinatown, a big Chinatown, and China City without a little India. So why is that prevents more collaboration between society?
Very, very interesting question over China and India. Very concrete questions. First question: if the India want to build a port over in South China Sea, Can China take that threat? I think China will take that as a threat, of course. That's what I mean is traditional understanding of the national security. I said it is a security dilemma between China and India. Until now, we haven't ignored it. It's reality. So whenever China wants to develop a relationship with Indian small neighboring countries, India is very concerned about that. The question is, if the Indians want to do help, for example, with like economic relationship with Vietnam, for example, if it's just military, bilaterally is economic, I don't think China will worry about that. China, until now, investment in South Asia from Chinese perspective until now is not military, right? China is building the port, for example, the Guadar. If you go to Guadar, it's not military. It's just the port wants to import the transition of trade products. How can you think this is military? But many Western media, even Indian media, they say this is a military port. This is not true. So if China develop, for example, want to build Guadar as a military port, military base, I think China have to really think about this is real concern of India. I think we have to take it seriously. But China is not do that. This is different. So when India want to build a good relationship with Vietnam, even you have military exchanges. I know you know Vietnam want to sell. India want to sell weapons to Vietnam. China didn't say anything. But you want to build the port. You want to want to have the oil exploration in South China Sea because it's a sovereignty. There's another question. It's similar like the Kashmir. So I think there's differences. The second is the students. In China, I remember last month ago, the Indian ambassador to Shanghai, the ambassador in Beijing to visit Shanghai, we had dialogue. There were many, I think both sides concerned most until now is about cultural exchanges, education exchanges. You are right. Very small number of Chinese students in India. I always encourage my students to study in Indian universities. But for them, they choose Singapore, Australia, USA, and Europe, not India. Why? You have to think about also the destination. You have to attract them. Another tourism. Very small number of Chinese tourists in India. I remember last year, very small number, 100,000 like that. Very small. Compared to Indians, to China. Even Chinese tourists to Thailand, to Sri Lanka, is a very similar number to India. So there are so many concrete issues that between China and India until now we have to face, now at the present time. But for the long-term understanding of China and India, as I mentioned, like the traditional security understanding, I think we have to take time. I'm still optimistic that the Indian governments will change in the second term, particularly Modi government change in the second term. For me, optimistic. Yeah.
Dr. Chaudhary.
Two questions. One is the Chinese military. I mean, how are you calibrating the policy with regard to modernization of the Chinese armed forces with regard to the foreign policy? Secondly, Russia. How is China's relationship with Russia factored in foreign policy in general?
In reference to India.
You mean with India?
South Asia.
Yeah, you mean the first question is about Chinese military posture,
Yes.
Military involvement. Yeah. If you look, Chinese military foreign defense just published a white paper, right?
Yeah.
If you look at, until now, China have the only military base in Djibouti. China didn't deploy any military personnel in overseas in other countries except the military base in Djibouti.
Just the beginning.
Yeah, maybe just the beginning. Yes, it's changing. but the question is, no more, until now, maybe more in the future. So it's hard, to answer your question is, your question actually the answer look at the future. China maybe have military involvement to protect, as you said, protect our own national overseas national interest, right? If I answer the question from as a professor of international relations from China, I would like to say, for China, it's very hard to use military means in overseas affairs to protect the Chinese people or even Chinese people's life or opportunity. It's very hard. First, is no, until now, Djibouti military base is also supply, not the real military bases. How about other places? So for Chinese PLA, it's very hard to deploy long distance, military personnel over to protect. Until now, it's like I cannot see in the next maybe.
Cambodia is.
No, it's until now it's a fake news. It's fake news. You already Cambodian government already shows that it's fake news. I don't think in next even 10 years, I don't think it's because you see that when China in US is now it's more competition, and India is also have an eye everywhere in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, on China's role. So China will be very careful. And the second is when China if China want to do this, China will be very, very concerned about Indian attitudes, Indian position. Because China think about China-Indian relationship. So next is China-Russia, right? Week ago, China and Russia have the first time militarily and strategically over around Northeast Asia, in Japanese Sea and East China Sea. First time joint military exercises, we can see that. Yeah, strategic movement. People think there's maybe another China-Russia military alliance. There are arguments in China. We have disagreed with that. It depends on how U.S. geopolitical, I use the word offensive, how the U.S. will do. And the China-Russia cooperation in Northeast Asia is concerned about the THAAD system in South Korea, because it's destabilized the global balance, military balance, is least in Northeast Asia. So one last point is when we talk about the great war, great power competition, smaller countries should be very careful, because as I remember, Malaysia Prime Minister Mahathir said, if the two elephants fight, the grass will suffer. So I agree with that. So when smaller side countries have to be very careful, don't choose side. That will be very benefits for small country, your own country, for country itself, and for big countries. That's until now is that. But who knows? Maybe there will changes. Yeah.
Surya, you wanted?
I'm Surya from RSIS, earlier Aerospace. I just want to know, you had mentioned two good ideas, rather new ones. ASEAN plus 2, ASEAN 10 plus 2, that is ASEAN, India, China. What exactly do you have in mind? After all, ASEAN is not in the business of mediating between China and India, or for that matter, between any other great powers. And secondly, this RIC, Russia, India, China, the format. Do you think Russia can at all play any role in improving relations between China and India, given that China-Russia relations are much closer today than China-India relations, of course, and also than Russia-India relations? And the third question is about military advisors in Pakistan. Do you have military advisors in Pakistan to protect CPEC projects? Because your point that the Chinese investments in South Asia are not military oriented but only economic projects, that is taken with a pinch of salt in South Asia, as you will be knowing very well. There is belief that at least military advisors from China are present in Pakistan to protect CPEC projects. Would you say something on that? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very, very good question. I didn't talk about too much just now in my presentation about the ASEAN +2. It's a very good idea. I think if it's benefits for ASEAN also, for China and India, if we do that. There are the difficulties. We have to think about is China in the last 30 years, I think it's at least 30 years, particularly in the 2 decades in this century, China don't oppose ASEAN to be a leading party in the regional integration. China always encourage ASEAN to lead this regional integration, economic, and even political. China supports that. How about India? I don't know.
No, both talk about ASEAN centrality,
Yeah.
but it's just.
But ASEAN stability it depends on how the big powers like China, Japan, India will do. If China say we don't want ASEAN to play as a central role, how to think about it? So it depends.
Even the US is saying ASEAN.
Yeah,
centrality.
India
So it is one of those
also
things
the
nobody-
USA do so. So the question is, if you look at if you look at all as I mentioned, if China and India cooperate, we don't see ASEAN region as a battleground for China-India strategic competition. That will change this region geopolitically and geoeconomically. Because think about China and India and ASEAN, plus the population, almost half of the world population. If you plus all the South Asian countries, half. So if all these countries, particularly China and India, cooperate with ASEAN, and ASEAN can play the mediating role, as you mentioned, between China and India, economically, culturally, China don't do anything to stop it. China will encourage that because it's good for China, PNR, it's also good for China's regional or peaceful region for Chinese development. So why not China to oppose that? So the question is how about India? Until now, I think the Indian government, the Act East foreign policy, just as I mentioned, in 2014 when Modi took office, they saying about the Act East foreign policy to increase Indians' political, particularly economic, cultural influence in ASEAN countries through Northeast Asia, through the Northeast India, through Laos, to Myanmar, to Thailand, to this region, to counterbalance China's influence. If so, I don't think the ASEAN can be a mediator between China and India. But I still hopeful. I think that India, the Modi government in second term, if the ASEAN can have one more, I think they have a one voice over these issues. Another, I always curious about the ASEAN voice. Why from my point of view, I don't want the ASEAN to have one voice over something. I don't believe that. I don't believe the ASEAN countries have one voice over India, over China, and even the American military presence in the region. I don't believe that. But I do hope ASEAN can play a role to make China and India together cooperation have one voice. That means when ASEAN countries have the summit meeting, ASEAN have the military meeting level, they can have the initiatively to encourage China and India together when ASEAN sits in between. That we want you both, we have 10 plus 2 together, we want this region. If ASEAN do this, India have no choice. I think India will join, and China, of course, will join. So I think that's one. Second, you have 3 questions. Last one, I would like to say very short about Pakistan. The CPEC, and I remember is China also talked about the military cooperation between China and Pakistan through APEC, but it's not through APEC. CPEC. Sorry. Not through CPEC, because CPEC is economics, projects, economic, some investment, even business park, like for the people's investment there. The military cooperation until now is anti-terrorism, because in Xinjiang, we have 3 evils there, and for India, for Pakistan, it's similar because through Pakistan, through Afghanistan, through Pakistan. So when you talk about a military advisor, I heard that, I also read that. I think China is doing the right thing, is have the military or even the advisor sent to Pakistan to how to deal with the terrorism, to help them. But it's not military support. It's just, I think, it's a very low level to give you advice how to deal with, how to counter terrorism. I think because China has the experience until now in Xinjiang, somewhere else, yeah. So I think until now, if the Pakistan government with Chinese government have already cooperation with that, it's just on this level. I don't believe see a higher level China will send a PLA inside. I don't believe that.
Is there any, Ambassador Hussain, do you know anything about
Yes,
Chinese military presence?
Security of Chinese is very important both to Pakistan and China, and that has been an issue of discussion between the two countries. And the Pakistan Army has raised a force, as you all know, about 10,000 strong or something. Now, I have not heard whether the Chinese military advisors have come, but considering that it's a serious issue, I would not be surprised if there is some sort of exchanges that are going on.
Chaho, yeah, last. Yeah.
So since you are a Chinese scholar, I want to ask you a question on China's digital Silk Road, which is the 数字思路. Because the Chinese official narrative is that it's part of the agenda, digital connectivity of the Big Belt and Road Initiative. But increasingly, we don't really see throughout the BRI countries that Chinese has sparked investments, that these tech investments are integrated well into the hard infrastructures of the Chinese projects. So I want maybe your take on this, because I'm also asking this question because every time somebody says that some Chinese companies go into different parts of South Asia to invest, some policymakers in New Delhi would jump up and become very angry and say, this is BRI, and BRI means national threat, the security threat to the entire region. So what's your take on this?
Thank you, Jiahao. I should say I'm not the economist. I'm not the economist, right? I'm a political science. I'm sorry I cannot answer your question directly to the digital Silk Road project. I don't know. Actually, I don't know anything about that. I do think Chinese foreign investments through the BNR initiative, there's one point when the Chinese government always say that many mass media or they don't believe that, but it's serious. That China want to really share its very advanced, highly advanced technology with neighboring countries, with the countries along the BNR. But why not accept it? One is, as I mentioned, we mentioned the Indian side, we jump. That is want to make it's a dead trap, right? It's kind of, I think, a psychological reaction until now. Even don't have that kind of problem. It's psychological feeling. That back to I first mentioned the security dilemma. When people, other countries, smaller countries, or even like India, is a big country in South Asia, regard China investment or military or even any influence there, regard China as a threat. It's very hard for them to change the mentality. So we do need time. We do need explanations from we should have more the narratives, of this BNR, not only just one voice from the Chinese government. So when we say we want to share the technology, we want to share this information technology, we want to share this other information with you, some gradually they believe they want to do. Like I remember in CPEC, there are small business now, investment now in Pakistan. And Chinese government As you remember, President Xi Jinping with Imran Khan, they talked several times about that. And small business now is growing through the, they call it industrial park in Pakistan. And China want to also through the digital economy is that want to, like the Alibaba, want to support. I remember like Huawei is doing with Alibaba now in Pakistan, want to help this small business like the Wango, through internet setting, because they are much easier to save the time, save energy. So I think this is maybe on one way that for China B&R to go abroad, maybe more acceptable in other countries.
I think we're beginning to run closer to the end. Yeah, yes, please.
Just one quick observation. Having been intimately involved in the economic front of Pakistan until 2014 as the governor of the central bank, I was intimately involved with some of these programs. And I can echo what Mr. Gual has mentioned, that CPEC is purely an economic program. I signed the currency swap agreement with China and Pakistan, and it was a historical agreement that was used primarily to support the balance of payment support that was needed in 2013 and 14. There's no military involvement here, best of my knowledge. The only military port, as you mentioned, is Djibouti, and I doubt it if Pakistan would ever allow any foreign military involvement in any of its military bases, particularly Gwadar or anyone else. They would not. The U.S. would not have agreed to the IMF agreement, the $6 billion, and last week they would not agree to the $125 million military support, because China is viewed as an adversary to the United States, not because of any immediate threat, but because of a long-term ideological issue that they have going back historically, with Five Eyes, with Australia, New Zealand, UK, and so forth. That's an ideological war that they're thinking of to prevent their supremacy from challenging the United States long-term. So I don't see there's any military involvement, and I can vouch for that. I don't think the military of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in Pakistan would allow any of that in any case. I can vouch for that. All the economic projects are strictly economic. The Pakistan Army has its own forces to protect the corridor from terrorist activities. That is a key focus of any military Pakistan involvement. That's just wanted to say that because I know this firsthand.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Clarification.
Thank
That's very useful.
Yeah.
Since we are on Pakistan, I had one small question. The Chinese always now ask about India-US relationship as a problem, but I never heard Chinese object to US-Pakistan relationship, which is older, which is deeper, which is historic, major non-NATO ally. It's gone on since 1950s, right? 1954, but I never see Chinese scholars or the government object to US-Pakistan relationship.
India will oppose that.
India will, but I wonder, because why is China only concerned about US-India relationship and not about US-Pakistan relationship? It's just a curious question.
I mentioned just one. You might. I think my answer in time is that when I was in Washington D.C. in 2017, after the election, and before the election, people talk about CPEC. He said, "Let China do that, because it's with money." So why the USA don't oppose CPEC even now?
No, I'm not going to CPEC. I'm
No,
just
no, no.
saying, yeah.
I'm back to the question.
Yeah.
Why? So why China oppose the U.S. involved military or even technology, military exchanges with Pakistan? Look at the Pakistan. I think it's not Chinese concern. It's an Indian concern. Right. So
That's nice.
yeah. So the military until now is exchanges with Pakistan. After 9/11, there's, that is that anti-terrorism cooperation between the U.S. wants cooperation, wants help from Pakistan, but later, after the 9/11, almost 20 years later, you can see that USA want to change. People, I remember half a year ago, or even last year, people talk about the U.S. shift of the South Asia strategy. Want to maybe lean more to India, not Pakistan, to counter China balance. But later they found it's hard. So I don't think until now China, because if the U.S. cooperation with Pakistan is benefit for this regional peace and stability, China will never oppose that because China wants this peaceful region. This is right.
Yeah.
Just very brief remark. I think also on the issue of taking action against militant organizations, there is a mutuality of interest between the United States and China. And one plays bad cop, one plays bad cop, other plays good cop. So that's also.
The last comment from there.
Just very quickly, purely on an economic sense, I'm not an expert on politics, but I can tell you that I believe the synergies between China, India, and Pakistan and Afghanistan are huge if they're properly capitalized. I'm on record in 2012-13. I gave approval for 3 Indian banks to come to Pakistan. Reserve Bank of India, my good friends Reddy and Subbarao, and I only worked 9 months with Rajan, but it's on record, and I was interviewed in your newspapers in India. I said, they were formally approved as far as I was concerned. I gave approval for 3 Indian banks. I left in 2014. I don't know what happened. They've never come to fruition.
So like so much in the India-Pakistan case, I mean, a lot of good things. We come so close and so far, but I would like to thank Professor Go, but before I close this, just a few concluding
Yes,
thoughts.
please.
I think the main focus on this shift in the major power relations, I think that's, I think we've come to a point where what we've seen for the last 40 years is not going to be the framework for the next 40 years. Change, I think, is inevitable, and I think if you look over the last, certainly even 70 odd years from the Second World War period, we've seen a constant shift in alignments. After all, US and Russia were allies against Germany and Japan. Then Mao Zedong sat in Moscow for a whole month saying, I want the security treaty signed. And then within 10 years, he broke the treaty. China and America fought in the Korean War. Then they became the best buddies against the Soviet Union. Now China and Russia are buddies against the Americans. So there will be alignments, realignments, de-alignments. So I think that's going to be an inevitable part of the life in the region. So I think there will be change. At this point,
Just one stop. You mean the traditional military alliance? I mean,
no, that was they call it military alliance or political alliance. After all, 1950 treaty between Russia and China was a military alliance. After all, China fought America in the Korean War. I mean, thousands of Chinese died, and not that many Americans, but some Americans died. So, and from there, China-Russia broke up. US and China got closer. India got closer to Russia because of that realignment. So I think there would be a structural change if the present arrangement between US and China is unsustainable. So I think, that is one part that all of us have to be prepared for it. How that adjustment, I think the Professor Go asked important questions. Does India benefit, or does India actually fear the negative consequences of a US-China, right? I mean, that you can argue, you can leverage the relationship as a swing state, but you could also be torn between the two competing powers. Look, does India go non-aligned again, or does it say, look, we are with one side and not with the other? Sometimes we say we're non-aligned, but we chose the Soviet Union against China and against the United States for a short while. So it's not always what we say, it is where the interest lies. So I think there'll be some adaptation, some adjustment that will take place. The second is that I think China's rise, whether it is contested by the Americans or not, is a reality. And I think South Asia, India, there was a time when India thought it was equal to China. But today the gap between China and India is large. I mean, China's GDP is 4.5 times bigger than India's. So that's a reality. And I think any realist in Delhi will start with that assumption. Look, China is bigger than you. China has military cooperation with Pakistan. We have to deal with it. China has, sells arms in my neighborhood. I have to deal with it. It's not a question of objecting to it or complaining. But the fact is, a rising China will project its military power. Will have more bases. I have no doubt about it. It's a matter of time. China
what's the next one? Where is the next one?
Maybe he thinks it is Goda. It could be anywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter where. Maybe Hambantota, you can name a lot of places. But a lot of them initially will be dual-use facilities. But at some point, as Chinese interests grow in the rest of the world, just as Portugal, We saw Portugal, we saw Netherlands, we saw France, we saw Britain, we saw Americans do exactly the same thing. So I don't see why China would be different, because if China has interest in the Indian Ocean, it's going to protect them. We must expect China to protect its interests, which means there will be more Chinese Navy in the Indian Ocean, more special relationships in the Indian Ocean. I think that's the story of international relations. As a realist, I see it's inevitable the Chinese footprint, including the military footprint, will grow in the Indian Ocean, and India will have to find a way of dealing with it. And there, the other story as a realist is when countries are going to balance. That till India and China have a boundary settlement, India would think China is a threat. Till China actually becomes neutral between India and Pakistan on the Kashmir question. Right now, it is not. It used to be neutral, but at this point, there's a slight technical problem in the way China deals with Indian Kashmir and Pakistani Kashmir. But we won't get into that minor detail. But the fact is, if Chinese attitudes change to India-Pakistan, I mean, from the Indian perspective, in India's favor, which I don't think is going to happen, then India has no reason to do balancing. So I think at the current circumstances, there would be some effort at balancing, but that doesn't mean India does not take the opportunities for cooperation with China. And I think that's where the real issues are, as you said, sir. In American retrenchment would fundamentally even bigger consequence than China's rise. That is, in America, that today pulling out of Afghanistan is pulled out of the Gulf or pulling out of the Gulf. He wants to get out of Korea. Mr. Trump comes back. He says, why we have so many troops? Why aren't the Koreans paying for themselves? So we are in a new situation there. An American retrenchment will force all of us in the region, that is, including India, China, and Pakistan, look, are we going to continue with this? Or can we work out new arrangements? That's where I fully share your optimism. For all the difficulties that we have, we must keep exploring the potential for cooperation.
Right.
But
right.
even small ones, I mean, limited ones, while managing the big differences that we need to find smaller areas where we can work together. And I think that's where the hope lies. And I'm quite confident that as we see in the years ahead, we've already seen since Wuhan some effort at it. But there's always going to be stress, but there is going to be more room to
Still more
to expand.
space.
Yeah.
More space. Yeah.
So that's where I think, but that leaves us in business for a long time. Those of us who study major power relations, those of us who study China's role in South Asia. So we really thank you for this important presentation, and we look forward to more engagement with our Chinese friends and Chinese scholars to see that this story is a dynamic story, is an unpredictable story. It's a story of immense possibilities while there are many dangers. So on behalf of the ISAS, I mean, this is something we hope to continue. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So are you here next week? Till when are you?
Yeah, and I will leave on Monday, next Monday.
Next Monday?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.